I want to rewind a little bit back to the 1980s with some good old Iron Maiden with the number of the beast. The Antichrist. From your scriptural study, do you see the Antichrist as a person, a hybrid person, something else, possibly an ET entity mixed in there? And then the final question is the mark of the beast. Is that something that from your studies that people are knowingly going to take, or is that going to be something that they're going to be given and not even realize it?
The second one's actually a little tougher than the first. None of the biblical writers have extraterrestrials on the brain. We're still living in the geocentric universe, so they're not thinking that. All the typology is consistent. That we don't have a false Christ in the sense that now we have a deity man who's evil and like a counterfeit virgin birth. This is the stuff Hollywood does. Nobody's thinking that. The idea is that since the Messiah in the Old Testament was perceived as, again, the king of Israel, the great warrior that's going to throw off the Gentile powers and all this stuff, the idea was that the Antichrist is sort of the great end times enemy of this Christ. So it's a human. If you're looking at Daniel 10, not Daniel 10, but Daniel 11, 1 and 12, everybody, regardless of eschatological system, recognizes that this describes the period of Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a man, he was a Gentile, who opposed, again, the Jewish kingdom, desecrated the temple, the abomination of desolation. That's the template for Antichrist. So it's a Gentile guy who's, in league with false gods or something like that, Satan. The number is a little more difficult because, on the one hand, this has a context. It's the number of a man. You could also translate the phrase a human number. There's a lot of ways you could take that. Some people think it's literally a stamp or a barcode or something like that somehow says 666. The early church entertained the idea that what they were really talking about was a magic square. Some of your listeners will no doubt know what magic squares are. The magic square for Jesus was 777. It's Sudoku, where all the lines vertical, they all add up to the same thing. 777 was the magic square for Jesus. 888 was God. 666 was something less than God and Jesus, an inferior power that had something to do with solar worship, the sun. So is that it? Well, maybe it could be. I mean, there are certain reasons why that might make sense. But it's also part of something called the name theology in biblical theology. To bear the name means to align yourself, to align your loyalty with. Israelites had the name pronounced over them in the Aaronic blessing. The command about not taking the Lord's name in vain, taking is actually the word for bearing. You do not bear the name of the Lord in vain. In other words, you don't represent the Lord in a worthless or irresponsible manner. So the idea of bearing the name is really an issue of assigning your believing loyalty to someone who that name represents. And that may very well be what we have in the book of Revelation. This is the name of the beast. See, the number is also called the name of the beast, the mark of the beast, bearing the name. So in other words, you could be bearing the name, bearing the mark, if you turn from Christ and assign your loyalty to something else. In other words, the Antichrist, himself, or Satan, who the Antichrist works for. That's a lot more ethereal and sort of non-corporeal, non-physical, non-visual than the sign. I don't know that that's the case. I don't think you can rule out a physical mark, because you have examples of that too, in the Old Testament. Name theology was also about ownership, and you could mark people, in the Old Testament. So that's still on the table. But I think any of those things are ways to think about the mark of the beast. But ultimately, when you really get down to brass tacks, ultimately it is about, I'm following the beast, the Antichrist, and his Lord instead of Christ, instead of Jesus. I'm making that decision. It's not something forced. It's somebody making that decision to take the mark, i.e. to follow this cosmic power. So I think that's really at the heart of it. No matter how it manifests itself, that's what people are doing.
So people will then have a conscious choice, and they will know what they're doing.
It's a choice. Yep. However that manifests itself, it'll be their choice.